Okay, so we begin thinking about this week's parsha, which is Ki Teitzei, when you will go out, referring to going out to battle. And there are many, many commandments in this parsha. I think it's the most of the entire Torah, 64 out of 613, if I'm not mistaken. And all kinds of various mitzvot that are being repeated. Now, sometimes they're actually repetition because you have Mishnah Torah, Deuteronomy is called Mishnah Torah, the repetition of the Torah, because Moshe repeats many of the principles and the laws. Some of those commandments are actually written earlier and they're reiterated here in a little bit of a different form. Other commandments are written here for the first time, but the tradition is that they were said Sinai, they were said 40 years earlier, and they were repeated here. So in the middle of the book, you have a big section, you have a section, what they call the section of the mitzvot, where you have a reiteration of many of the commandments. So a lot of that is in this week's parsha, some of that last week's parsha. So just to say a few points about this reiteration. On the surface, you could think about it and say that it is saying the same thing again for emphasis. But when you look carefully, you have to ask yourself a few questions. First of all, why are only some commandments written explicitly a second time? And if you look carefully, you can start thinking about the differences between the way they're mentioned the first time and the way they're mentioned the second time. So you can have the same mitzvah, but the emphasis is different. And then the question is, why is the emphasis different? So first you want to recognize and identify the differences, and then you want to be able to explain why those differences are, why the differences are so. And there are all kinds of theories. Like one theory is that Moshe now is preparing the Jewish people to enter the land of Israel. So the mitzvot that he's saying now are highlighting how this mitzvah plays out in the life of the nation, of the collective, not just as the individual. So that's one theory. There are other theories. Maybe there's one overarching theory, maybe there isn't. I'm going to send an email later about one mitzvah of returning the lost object and how that is reiterated in this parsha, and the differences between the way it appears in the first time it was written in Exodus and the way it was written the second time in the book of Deuteronomy, and what we can learn from there, etc. So that's just a sample, but this could be done to every mitzvah that was reiterated. So that's point number one. Point number two is we want to think about the groupings of the mitzvot between last week's parsha and this week's parsha. Last week's parsha, we're talking about the institutions of the Jewish people or the nation of Israel. What are those institutions? So we started with the justices, with the courts, so the judiciary, and then we talked about the monarch, and then we talked about the priest, and we talked about the Levites and the prophets. So you have a separation, maybe four-way separation of powers, maybe three or four, depending on how you count. There's the law, which is the judges. There is the king or the monarch or the executive leader. So you have the executive branch. And then you have sort of the moral voice, which would be the prophets, and in some cases, the priests and the Levites. Okay. There are also mitzvot that refer specifically to the collective that the individual cannot do on their own. And the example is the mitzvah of war, the laws of war, right? War is something that a nation engages in, not an individual. So the laws of war are last week's parsha. This week's parsha seemingly would begin with laws, with the division is that anything that's sort of the collective is last week's parsha, but this week's parsha, we go to the individual person's responsibilities toward their fellow and toward the poor, etc. But we shift from the collective of the Jewish people as a whole to the individual. That's sort of the general division. Now, the problem with that division is the beginning of this week's parsha seems to be part of last week's parsha, because the beginning of this week's parsha is Ki tetzei milchama, when you will go to war with your enemy. Now, laws of war were last week's parsha. War is the collective. So why is the beginning of this week's parsha the laws of war? So it's not a very difficult question to answer, because if you continue reading, you will see that the Yes, we're talking about the context of war, so we're in the backdrop of war, but the concern and the issue we're dealing with is an individual's issue. And that is that an individual person sees a beautiful woman and he wants to marry her, and she's not Jewish. So there's the process of how you can bring her into your home, and over time you could marry her. And if you choose not to marry her, you may not oppress her. You have to let her go free. And we could that's the details of the laws. The issue is that the issue, what I'm trying to get at is that we're not talking about the collective nation's problem. In other words, what do we do? How do we wage war? How do we conquer? That was last week. This week is what do I do from the individual person has a very individual as a specific instincts. He wants to marry a specific or have relations with a specific woman. How do you what is the regulation? How do you deal with that? So that's why, even though we're talking about war, we're talking about the individual person's struggle with the that happens during in the backdrop of war. So that is on the one level. Now we get to the Hasidic level, the Hasidic interpretation, even before the Hasidic interpretation, actually. And the sages, many of the commentaries talk about this, and they say that there is literal battle, and then there is spiritual battle, internal battle. And battling the enemy, the external enemy, is the collective's problem. But battling the internal enemy, the internal challenge, that is something very difficult. And that's something that continues constantly, even after the war is over. There's a metaphor from one of the great Jewish philosophers, Rabbeinu Bechaya. He says that once upon a time there was a general who was returning from battle in victory. And as he's returning home, he meets the sage, and the sage says, "I want to wish you a lot of luck in the battle." So he says, "The battle, we were just victorious in the battle. I just overcame the enemy." He says, "No, I'm talking about the internal inclination. Now that you won the external inclination, now you're going to have to come face to face with your own negativity, and that's the true battle, and that's where you need a different set of skills." So, in other words, many of the commentators and the mystics read these verses, and they say, we're not talking about collective battle, that too, but how do we interpret these verses to talk about the spiritual challenge within a person, and what lessons could we glean from these verses to give us insight into our own spiritual life and our own spiritual challenges? So that's the background against which this discourse is written, and this discourse starts talking about prayer, because prayer, the Zohar says, the time of prayer is a time of battle between the godly soul, the animal soul, the positive instincts, the negative instincts. And then we want to think about what of these, why do the sages institute the prayer in certain ways, and what are the insights we can glean from that? And it's related, of course, to the Parsha, etc. I just want to say one thing, that the verse Ki Tetzeh Milchama is, you have you can think about the grammar, and you can talk about, usually you want to go to battle, you would say li milchama. Li is to, la is to the. Now, when you say to the, means it's the known, the famous. So what battle are we talking about? You should say ki tetzeh the milchama, when you go to war. What's to the war? So that's another indication that we're talking about the war everybody knows about. Because we're not talking about a specific geographical conflict or specific conflict with one neighbor or another. We're talking about the famous war, which is the internal war, and that's what we have to think about. So that is by way of introduction. Comments, questions, welcome. And then we'll be able to jump into the actual discourse. So thank you, and thank you for joining, and thank you for listening. Okay. Let's think about the big idea, and then we'll talk about, well, I will try to think about the discourse inside. So what's the big idea? The big idea is that, okay, let's start with the grammar of the verse, because everything has to come back to the verse. So the verse says like this: Ki tetzeh la milchama, when you will go out to battle, to the battle, to the war, to the battle. Al oivecha. Now, this is an interesting word. Al oivecha means on your enemy, but al could be above your enemy, right? Al is on top. Now, seemingly, the translation should be when you will go to the battle with your enemy. What is al oivecha? On your enemy, or on top of your enemy. So one interpretation is that if you go out to battle and you have faith in God and you're going to fulfill the commandments of the Torah, you are going to come out, you're going to emerge victorious. And part of going to victory, part of going to the battle, is that the person has to have confidence that they are going to be victorious. And that's why all military music is not, you think of battle as a very scary time, but that's not the way military music works. The way military music works, it is sort of a march of confidence. Chabad has adapted some of those battles to become Hasidic nigunim. Most famously is Napoleon's march. The Hasidim have a tradition that they are at the music that Napoleon's armies crossed into Russia. The Hasidim heard it and they made it into Hasidic nigun, and we sing it every year, especially on Yom Kippur. So the idea is that you're going to battle, you can't go to battle with trepidation. You have to go to battle with confidence that you're going to be victorious. Otherwise, you're not going to be victorious. So the mindset is that you go out, la milchama al oivecha, that you are on top of your enemy, that you have the power to overcome. And that confidence is alluded to in the word al oivecha, on top of your enemy. So that's one interpretation. The Hasidic interpretation that we're going to get to is, if you want to be victorious, you have to go on top. Meaning to say, you have to go to the source. That's the key here. Alevecha, you have to go on top of the enemy. In other words, do not battle the enemy as the enemy manifests down here and how it expresses itself down here. But you have to go to the spiritual source of the enemy. And if you interact with the spiritual source of the enemy, then you will be able to be victorious. And ultimately, that will trickle down to the enemy, the way the enemy stands manifest before you, the way you see it. And what we're going to talk about is, you're going to have to think about, if we're talking about the internal battle between the godly and the animalistic within the person, you want to think about what is the source of the animal soul. And once we understand what's the source of the animal soul, we'll understand why there's so much emphasis in our morning prayer that the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, the members of the Great Assembly, sages who instituted the prayer 2,400 years ago, they put in so many references to the source of the animal soul, because they understood the principle that you should not, if you have a physician here, he'll tell you that you're not supposed to, always, sometimes it's better not to necessarily deal with the symptom, but you have to go to the root cause. And if you're battling the animal, you have to go to, what is the source of this animal? What does it really want? How do we interact with the source of the animal? And then you'll be able to be victorious also, because that recognition and that awareness will trickle down also to the enemy that stands before you. So that is the big idea. Now, to take this apart, what exactly do we mean? So one Kabbalistic concept that is, I think it's a very important, in other words, I think it's very general to the Kabbalistic understanding, is that everything in this world doesn't begin in this world. Everything that we see in this world has a spiritual origin and comes from the spiritual world. I would even say spiritual worlds, because it doesn't just come from one place, it trickles down, it evolves over many stages and many layers, which the Kabbalists call different spiritual worlds. But the point here is that everything in the physical sense is not in a vacuum. It has to come from a higher source. And in that sense, the higher worlds and the lower worlds are connected. Why are they connected? Even though there's a very big spiritual gap, a tremendous gap between the physical and the spiritual. But if you think about the same concept that exists in this physical world, and maybe in this physical world, the manifestation of this concept is not holy and pure, but it is a chain. It evolves from its spiritual source, and in the spiritual source, it is positive and holy. So one way that, if the Kabbalist looks around, he doesn't necessarily see the phenomenon that I see outside my window. He sees the tree, sees the spiritual source of the tree. And if a Kabbalist can adapt that perspective, that creates the connection between this higher worlds and the lower worlds, because, like the Zohar says, the physical world is created just like the spiritual world. So in some sense, it's a mirror image. Now, in the mirror image, things change, but it's still a mirror image. right? If you talk about you have a mirror and you have a small mirror and you could see the sun. So of course you're not going to have the entire sun in the mirror, and the intensity of the sun cannot be in the mirror. But in some ways, the mirror is reflecting some truth about the sun, the brightness of the sun. So therefore, like the Zohar says, Alma Tata, this lower world is created, Kigavna, it's created just like the Alma Ilah, just like the spiritual source. Just like the higher worlds. When you look around phenomenon, you could see this. You could either see, I see something that's physical, that's brute, that's materialistic, or you could see, I see a reflection of the spiritual world. And this is the choice the person has. What do you want to look at? You want to look at the enemy, or do you want to look on top of the enemy? What is the source of the enemy? Go ahead, Vicky, please.
Oh, thank you, Rabbi. Quick question, maybe I missed it. When you talk about mirror image, you usually have the mirror image the other way. It's twisted. So right.
Yeah. So I'm not going to focus on the twisted part. I'm going to talk about it's not the same. It evolves. It evolves, but there's still a relationship. There's still a reflection. There's still a reflection. You don't have to go to the spiritual world. You can go to a very physical example that the Hasidism brings to express this point. If you want to talk about when you want to say something is sweet, okay? So what is sweet? So on the physical sense, sweet means that in the taste buds, it tastes sweet. Cotton candy is sweet, right? But then you could say, you know something, if you go to a little more spiritual plane, sweet is a sweet melody. Sweet melody is sweet. In Hebrew, it works even better because the word ta'am is the same word for taste and the same word for reason. Because when something tastes good, you say an idea makes sense. You say, this tastes good. So you're saying the same word as something tangible as the taste bud could be the taste bud of the tongue, and then it's a taste bud of the brain, right? It's the same concept. It tastes good. Now, what does it mean? To which senses? The tongue has one set of taste buds, one definition of sweet, but the ears have a different. The music is sweet. And then ideas are sweet, right? And then there's the sweetness, the chesed, the kindness of God, the kindness, chesed of Atzilut. The Kabbalah says chesed of Atzilut. You have the attribute of kindness in the Atzilut in the highest world, the divine kindness. And then you say, you take a bite into an apple has sweetness. Assuming it's not too sour. Now we're getting to the season of apple picking. Okay, the apples are ripening. Okay, so you have apple. Apple has a metikut. Apple has a sweetness. Where does the sweetness of the apple emerge? So it doesn't emerge 6 days in the 6 days of creation when God creates the world. That's only the physical manifestation of the apple. I should say day 3 when God says let the earth give produce. But the concept of sweetness exists before creation. It exists ultimately, chesed atzilus, in the sweetness and the kindness of God. Now that's going to the most spiritual sense, but I'm saying even in the physical world, there's layers and there's an evolution of sweetness.
But it's not, I'm talking about the accuracy of the metaphor, because it's probably the way you described it, it's more reflection than the mirror image.
Right. Mirror image maybe wasn't the perfect translation. The Zohar says kigavna. Now kigavna is a tricky word, because kigavna means like or just like. Now, like could mean exactly like. Like could be similarities, right? So when I say that, if I say the apple is like the divine kindness and Atzilut, it's not necessarily that if you think it's exactly the same, no, it's not exactly the same, but it has similarities. So when a person sees an apple and says sweetness and says, I see the physical sweetness of the nutrients of the apple, or the Kabbalah says, I see this as a manifestation of a divine kindness, right? So it's a question of what am I looking at? Am I looking at this object, or am I looking at the source of this object? Am I going to the source? Now, source is this at least 4 worlds, and every world is multiple layers. Even in the physical world, sweetness has multiple layers. So I'm just saying it just goes on and on and on, but there's an evolution. The point is, even if there's a ladder of 1,000 steps, the lowest rung is still connected to the highest rung. So for the Kabbalist, when he sees a physical phenomenon, even if it's down here, there's nothing holy or spiritual about it. But if you climb the ladder, and if you look at this and you say, you're walking down the street in Manhattan and you see a skyscraper, you don't know that it's a skyscraper. If you're living in New Jersey and you're looking across the ocean, wow, You go looking across the river, you see a skyscraper. But if you're walking down the street, you're walking down the street in Manhattan, Midtown Manhattan, you don't see any skyscrapers because you're not looking up. So you could live your whole life and just see the storefronts. Not that there's nothing to see. I mean, you could see, you could buy stuff if you want to. But what happens if you're the Kabbalist? If you're the Kabbalist, the metaphor is you're walking down the street, you see floor number one, and you say, I'm very interested. What's on top of that? Right? And then you lift up your gaze. And as you lift up your gaze, you go higher and higher. Eventually you see the sky. And then you see this storefront that I'm looking at, this looks like a regular CVS, is indeed a skyscraper. Now, in the physical sense, it's the opposite. It's you start building on the bottom and you go up. But in the spiritual sense, it's the opposite because the skyscraper starts in the sky and comes down to the earth. But the point here is I have a choice of where I'm just going to look at what is in front of my eyes and be satisfied with that, or am I going to say, where does that come from? Or like we say, Isaiah says, it was a haftarah of 2 weeks ago, or 3 weeks ago, lift up your eyes heavenward and see who created these. And by the way, I think I said this in the past, but it's a very beautiful concept I don't know who the origin of this is, but it's written in Hasidic literature, but it probably precedes the Hasidic literature, and that is that the word Shema Yisrael, Hero Israel, Shema is an acronym, Shema, Shin Mem Ayin, Se'u Maro Meinechem, lift up to heaven your eyes. That's the idea of Shema. You could live your whole life and just look at the world at the surface level. But then you look upward, and what happens even physically, when you look upward, you see how it's not about us, how small we are, right? And then automatically you start wondering. You don't wonder when you're walking down the street and looking at the tree in front of you. There's very little wonder. The wonder happens when you look up. And that ability to look up and sense that what we have is a reflection of a higher truth, that's where the mystical experience begins. That's Kabbalah, that's spirituality.
It also ties back to what you said once about the higher source, like the lower person falls, the higher the source.
Yeah, that's a Kabbalistic truth.
That
Whatever's higher falls down lower. So that's why. By the way, that if you want to talk about a mirror image, it's exactly the mirror image of what you're talking about. In a way, what started out very high comes up very low because the mirror flips it. But there, the metaphor is if you have, for example, a wall, the wall collapses, then what was higher falls farther than the space of where the wall was. So I'm sure you're a poet. We can work out the details of the. We'll have a poetry session here with the Kabbalah and poetry. We'll work out all the metaphors because metaphors are important because the metaphor is all of creation in a sense is a metaphor for the divine power that's creating it. So that's what we're trying to get at.
beautiful.
You have to undo the metaphor. Yeah.
Yeah.
Some is metaphor, some is a riddle, but that's another story.
Yeah. But the mirror image, like in the sense that it's actually both, right? I don't know what in this particular discourse, but it's very comforting to know that even
that's a good point. That and in a way, the farthest thing is reflected it has the higher source, so it's expressing itself in the opposite way. So in that sense, mirror image is very good.
right.
Very good. Thank you. See, just a few minutes of talking, now we work it all out. Good. We're lifting up our eyes heavenward. Okay, go ahead, Bob, please. Bavakasha.
Good morning, both Vicky and Rabbi. It seems like we're always in a dynamic equilibrium between looking up and staying down. Creation occurred because God wanted to be in our presence, and many of the weeks we discuss Kabbalah, you focus on it's important to stay in the earthly matters and create mitzvahs here and there and whatever. And then on the odd week, you'll say, well, it's important to look, above the milk. And so it is a bit dizzying to get. So is there an algorithm whereby you say, kind of look at the buildings on the ground floor and focus on those and occasionally look up? Or are we looking up and then occasionally looking down? I think it's the former, but I just want a little clarification.
The short answer is I don't know. And the reason why I say I don't know is A, because I don't know. But B, because I also don't think it's a one answer fits all. In other words, there are going to be certain people that everyone has to have in the Kabbalistic, in the mystical tradition of Judaism. It goes all the way back to Isaiah, based on Ezekiel. The Haftarah, the first day Rosh Hashanah, Chayot Ratzov Hashov. Chayot is the animals, meaning the angels, but it's interpreted to be the Chayut, the life force. The life force of the world runs and returns. In other words, there has to be a pulse. You have to go upward and downward. The heart has to pump. You have to has to open and close. And that is the heart rate of creation and spiritual creation. In other words, we have to go ratso, to run is to go, sort of reconnect to our spiritual sense, to our spiritual self, or to the higher self, or to God, call it what you want. But then you also have to return. Why do you have to return? Because that's the purpose of creation. Now, if I only return, if I'm only in the physical world, then I'm going to be disconnected from my spiritual source. The danger is, like the spies were afraid to go into the land of Israel, the danger is that the earth will swallow me up. That I get so involved in materialism that instead of me sanctifying the materialism sort of is going to swallow me up. On the other hand, the other danger is the escape. I want to be spiritual, and I want to be disconnected. If that's the case, I'm like Chanoch in Genesis. We went up to God. We're not looking. God is not looking for angels. So everybody, what is universally true, that every person to some degree, you're going to have the balance between running and returning. Now, there's all kinds of ways of thinking about this. One way, because it's Friday, Shabbat and weekday, right? So weekday is involvement in the world, you're returning, and Shabbat is in a way retreating to not to impact the world. Shabbat is not a time to impact the world. Shabbat is not a time to perfect the world. Shabbat is a time to re-energize, come back to yourself, even rest. What is rest? When you're accomplishing, you're running around. When you rest, you come back and you sit down on your couch. And why is that so enjoyable? Because you're coming back to self. Now I don't have to do anything. Now it's coming in touch with who I really am. What do I really like? What do I really want? Who are the people I want to be with? So even this idea of the running and returning, of being invested in the world and retreating to self, or retreating to soul, or retreating to God, everybody has that. Everybody must have both those components. If I don't have both those components, there's I won't be able to live a meaningful spiritual life. In other words, a meaningful life, because I'm going to either be disconnected from the physical or disconnected from the spiritual, and either of those are no good. Okay, now the question is, what is my ratio of the running and returning? And for that, the answer is it depends. Some people's job, and even in the Talmud, you have people that most of their job was they were scholars, so they're into study. They're not so invested in practical matters. Now the Talmud says someone who says I only have Torah and I don't have gemilut chasadim, I don't have acts of kindness, even Torah you don't have. If I say I'm just studying Torah, but I'm not doing any good in the world, then you don't even have Torah. Why? Because the whole purpose of Torah is the shuv, is the return, is to impact the world, right? But nevertheless, this person or these people, there's a group of people that for them, that for their spiritual makeup, their contribution is not so much in the practical. That contribution is more in the realm of study, in the realm of ideas. So for them, the ratio of running and returning is going to be more toward the ratio. Then the Talmud says there are people mare uvdin tavin. They're the masters of good deeds. In other words, their spiritual makeup is what they're supposed to do is they're supposed to do mitzvot. Mitzvot means refining the world, doing good things in the world. Now, everybody has to study Torah. Even if somebody says, I give charity, and I'm not so inclined to study, that's not meaningful for me. I'd rather go make more money and support more poor people, and we'll support more educational institutions. Even that person has to make time to study. Everyone has to study. Now, the minimum is, the Talmud says, the minimum is saying Shema, one verse in the morning and one verse at night. So the minimum is the Shema. Shema is also Torah, but everybody has to study Torah. Okay, so everybody's going to have the idea that I'm retreating to the spiritual source and I am returning to the physical world. When I say what is the ratio, it depends on your spiritual mission. It depends. So there's no one answer. But even every morning, everybody covers their eyes. Everyone says God is one, and covering your eyes means that there's going to be some disconnect with the world around me. I'm not seeing, I'm not looking at the reality the way it is. I want to soar higher, but then you open up your eyes. Otherwise, you're going to crash into the pole in front of you. You're going to get onto the wrong train, right? So the bottom line is everybody has to have that run and return. I don't think there is a formula, because I don't think there is one formula for everybody. That's my point.
So like a chemical reaction, it really is a dynamic equilibrium.
Yes.
And
Yes.
the greatest metaphor of spirituality was the desert, right? 40 years in the desert, and that's why that was no good, because there was a reluctance of them to interface with the real world,
Right.
or Eretz Yisrael. So
Correct.
that dynamic equilibrium is important, and I like what you're saying. It's got to be individual.
Yeah.
And if I'm a physician and deliver babies on Rosh Hashanah, as long as I say a prayer or two, Hashem will forgive me.
Right. And it's not forgive. It's not forgive. You're doing the
God's
shoot
word.
life into the world. It's not a question of forgiving. It's a mitzvah.
Yeah.
It's a mitzvah for it's not a question of forgiveness. But I'm saying, but everybody has to have moments where they do both.
Right.
Can't say, I'm so spiritual, I just care about the heavens, I don't care about what's happening on this earth. That's what the Talmud says. Even if someone says, I only have Torah, I don't have anything else. So then you don't even have Torah because Torah without an application is not Torah, right? Because you're just running without returning. And this goes back to the earliest book of Kabbalah, Sefer Yetzirah, the book of formation, which is attributed to Rabbi Akiva, but it's very, very old. And people say that Abraham came up with the ideas, but a very famous statement there. It's a very short book, very short book, relatively speaking. It's a few pages, but one of the most famous quotes from there is "Im ratz livcha shuv le'echad." If your heart runs, return to oneness. So that's where you get the phrase of, it's a play on Ezekiel, but Im ratz livcha, your heart runs. I really want to cleave to God. I want to become more spiritual. So I have to return, and then return to oneness. Find the oneness on this earth. Right? Bring the oneness into this earth. That's what that. But I have to have that pulse. I have to have that. I have to have that tension, right? I have to have that tension between being pulled in two different directions, and I'm not completely comfortable in one of those directions. You have the sages in the Mishnah say something similar. They say in the Ethics of the Fathers, al karcha chatachai, al karcha chatamet. You live against your will, and you die against your will. So in other words, you don't fully want to be alive. My soul wants to go to heaven. On the other hand, I don't want to die. I want to be on earth. So which one do I want? So the answer, I want both. There's a certain tension between I'm not completely comfortable wherever I am. If I'm in heaven, the soul senses that the goal is to be down here. If I'm down here, the soul senses that the true reality is in heaven. And this, in many ways, the reality down here is distracting and distracting from the true reality. So you have this tension. Tension is not a bad thing. Tension is a sign of life.
Terrific. Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you. Go ahead, Vicky, please.
Oh, thank you, Rabbi. I just want to thank Bob for the question, because his question made me think about something we talked about earlier. And maybe the solution question is maybe the solution to his dizziness problem is to think about the higher unity and the lower unity at the same time.
Yeah. Again,
Where you can actually experience both at the same time. Maybe not all the time, maybe.
I want to say I'm not afraid of dizziness. That's my point here. My point is that love, right? You have a relationship. Relationship is also going to have some of this tension, right? Because the way relationship works is you have at least a passionate relationship is that on one hand you want to feel close with the other person, right? So there's a feeling of oneness. On the other hand, there's tension, there's intensification of the relationship that is generated because of the sense of distance, because of the sense that we're not one, right? Either geographically or emotionally, either we're distant physically or we're emotionally distant, or one of us is out of touch with the other. So that creates distance, that creates separation. Now, you could say, I don't want to have any of that tension in my relationship. That would be a shame, because at the end of the day, the relationship is intensified by that running and returning, right? So if I want to say that I want to have a tranquil life, I want to have tranquility in my relationships, I want to have tranquility in my day, we don't really want that, right? The tension is the stuff of life. That's where we grow. That's where the emotions grow. That's where, so we feel like we say, oh, if I could, I would just sit on my beach chair and relax all day. It's only enjoyable to sit on your beach chair and you relax after you're working for 6 days. And when you know you have another 6 days to go back to achieve something, right? So you have to have that tension of which one do I want to do? But if I'm comfortable, the point is, I'm not afraid. The point is, I am not running away from the tension. That's what I'm trying to say. It's not a problem that has to be solved. It's a tension that has to be managed.
Right, but in the middle of that, what I was trying to say, in the middle of this running and returning, there are moments where they actually
Yes, yeah. Because each one benefits the other. Shabbat affects who you are during the 6 days of the week. And the 6 days of the week are also affected by the Shabbat. I'm a person who rested on Shabbat. So now when I come back Sunday morning or Monday morning, I don't have the Monday morning blues because I am sort of in touch of what I'm supposed to be doing. And I'm in touch with my spiritual anchor. And now I have the energy that it takes to go out and impact the world. Right. So the person I am in the 6 days of the week is impacted by the person I am in Shabbat and vice versa. Right. So it's not like I'm two different people, have a complete dichotomy between the two, and the person is sort of bipolar. You know, I have two opposite extremes in my life, and I'm trying to dance between the two. No, it's I myself have both these elements, and whatever element I am in, the running is affected by the returning, and the returning is affected by the running. In other words, even when I run, I know I'm going to return, which is another whole subject. There's a Talmud in Tractate Chagiga where it says 4 sages, nichnasu the pardes, went into the orchard, and that's a metaphor for they delved into the secrets of creation or the secrets of Kabbalah, and 3 of them were affected negatively. 1 person died. The Talmud lists their names. 1 person died. 1 person went crazy. 1 person became a heretic, and Rabbi Akiva nichnas b'shalom v'yatza b'shalom, went in peace and came out in peace. He entered the orchard in peace and exited the orchard in peace. That's the Talmudic phrase, which is basically a cautionary tale. You got to be careful if you're going to try to delve into the mystical area with the full intensity. So the Hasidic interpretation of this is very beautiful. Why was Rabbi Akiva? Now, all the other people, it doesn't say how they entered. It just says what happened on the way out. Rabbi Akiva, it says, nichnas b'shalom v'yatza b'shalom. He went in peace and went out in peace. So the Hasidic philosophy asks, 1 second, why do you have to say he went in peace? Just say he went out in peace. All the other ones, you just explain how they went out. And the answer is no. Why did Rabbi Akiva leave in peace? Because he entered in peace. Peace is harmony. Peace is making peace between 2 extremes. In other words, even when he ran, even when he delved into the mystical, he wasn't doing it and forgetting about the physical. He knew that in a few minutes I'm going to come out, right? So the approach is different, right? 1 person is engaging in mystical thinking and mystical thought and spirituality as an escape from the world. And then if you're trying to escape and you do that too intensely, you may escape. You may go crazy. You may lose your ability to interact and live in civilization. Rabbi Akiva, he went in peace. In other words, even the entrance into the mystical and to the spiritual was in peace, meaning in peace with the physical. So I'm running so I can come back, right? So that's built into the approach. That's my point. It's in the approach. So even in the approach, I know that I'm going to come out. As opposed to the person says, I'm running to the mystical, I'm running to the spiritual, I'm throwing everything out, everything else is meaningless. That's then you're going to go, it's going to have a negative effect. Either heresy, because heresy would be the disconnect between the physical and the spiritual, because I'm either here or there. There's a disconnect, etc. So the bottom line is that I'm 1 person who has this tension, but I have both of these aspects, and the ratio and the exact amount, it depends on the individual person. Okay, let's go back to what we're trying to say in 3 more minutes. Let's think about the animal soul. What is the animal soul? The animal soul is the person's negative desires. When I say negative for the purpose of our discussion, is unholy, unspiritual. And a person comes to the prayer, and the time of prayer is to awaken, to do the mitzvah of the Shema, which is the awareness of God. But not just awareness, it's not just in the abstract. Like we said in the parsha a few weeks ago, we say it in the prayer every day, V'yadata hayom, you should know today, V'ashivota levavecha, you should take it to heart, right? We don't just study for knowledge per se. I want to have a philosophical angle to look at the world. But the question is, how is that knowledge going to impact my heart? And that's exactly what the Shema says. Shema says, Shema Yisrael, hear, O Israel, pay attention, look upward, look at the skyscrapers, look heavenward. The Lord is our God, the Lord is one. And therefore, love the Lord your God. Now, love is tricky, because love means this is what I really want. But I look at my soul and I say, I have other desires. So now I have even the Mishnah. Before you get to mystical thinking, the Mishnah talks about v'ahavta, love the Lord your God b'chol levacha, with all your heart, says the Mishnah, b'shnei yitzarecha, with both your inclinations, with the good inclination, with the bad inclination. So the point is that very early on in the Mishnah we realize that it's not so simple to love God, and certainly not so simple to love God fully, because a person has other desires, and some of those other desires are antithetical to godliness. And even if it's not antithetical, if you're really in love, you can't love two people, right? If you're really in love, it's supposed to be all inclusive. So if you love God, you love God. How could you love God and love ice cream cones? Okay, so that's the problem. So now the question is, how do I channel the love of the animal soul to direct it toward the love of God? And that's a mystical idea. It's a spiritual idea, but it's in the law. It's in the Talmud, Tractate Brachot, like I mentioned. You love the Lord your God with all your heart. All your heart means the evil inclination is transformed. So how do you do that? So the Talmud doesn't say it's, I guess, the meditation. But what am I meditating about? What am I thinking about? So here comes the Hasidic idea. The Hasidic idea says like this. We call it an animal soul. Now, the animal soul. Where does the animal soul come with the premise that we established earlier, or we mentioned earlier, that everything in this physical world has a spiritual source? Where does the animal soul come from? It comes from the holy animals. What are the holy animals? If you open up the book again, Ezekiel, the vision of Ezekiel that we read on the first day of Shavuot, in the Haftorah, talks about the divine chariots, and it talks about, that's the most mystical chapter in the entire Bible. And there it talks about that there's animals. You see the divine chariot, there's animals, all kinds of animals. There's Pnei Aryeh, there's a lion, there's Pnei Nesher, there's an eagle, there's Pnei Shor, there's the ox, all kinds of animals. And it refers to them ba'ofanim, and the wagons of the, we say it in prayer every day, ba'ofanim, the wagons of the wheels of the wagon, which is supposed to be one form of the angels, the chayot hakodesh, and the holy animals. And the idea here is that you have the spiritual animals and the physical animals, that is the animal soul, manifests and comes and devolves, or evolves, but I'll say devolves from the spiritual perspective, devolve from the spiritual, from the spiritual animals. Or like my father would call the kids when they were very wild, he would call them, instead of saying in Yiddish, you say wilde chaya, wild animal. But he would want to soften it a little bit, so he would say chayot hakodesh, the holy animals. Right? If the angels are holy animals, then his kids are also holy animals. In any case, so that's the idea. What are we getting at? We're getting at as follows. Why are the angels called animals? Because animal represents, at least in Hebrew, chai is the passion, the life, and the energy. And an animal is stronger than a human being. They have more passion. So the idea here is, if you want to talk about the emotion, the emotional state could be linked to the animal. And the angel is the state of being where the love of God is intense, much more intense than the human being can produce down here. Because the human being is, we have a few problems. Problem number one is that we are in a material world, so materialism is real to us and spirituality is abstract. So we cannot generate the love. We cannot generate, it's so difficult to us to generate love the way the angels have it. But another problem is we're also intellectual. We're intellectual beings, and therefore intelligence is more complex. Love is very much one-dimensional. If a person is in love, they don't see the spectrum, right? If you see in love, love is blinding. You don't see the faults in people. You can't be analytical and in love at the same time. You can't be analytical about the subject of your love. It doesn't work, because love is like fire, and it's passionate. And by definition, to analyze, you have to break things down into small little pieces, and the passion evaporates. So we do not have the same level of intensity of love the way the animals have, the way the spiritual animals have, for multiple reasons. But what the Kabbalah is saying here is the animal soul has passion, and has passion for physical material things. Where does that passion come from? Where does that passion come from? That passion trickles down. If we started in saying that everything trickles down from the spiritual source, so the love that the animal soul has for materialistic things, where does that phenomenon come from? It comes from the fact that there is a spiritual love. The source of the physical love is that there is a spiritual, intense love to what is good, what is desirable, what is the source of everything, which is God. So how does this phenomenon happen? That there is a phenomenon of a desire for something materialistic? Where did that come? It didn't come in a vacuum. It came, it devolved. It's the mirror image, it's the opposite image of the concept of intense love to God, passionate love to God. Now, if you open up the prayer book and you see that, okay, well, I don't want to get too much time, but you have the mitzvah of the Shema, which is one of the central pillars of prayer. There's two central pillars: there's the Amit and there's the Shema. Now, the sages instituted that we say blessings before and after the Shema. And before the Shema, there's two blessings, at least in the morning, at night also, but in the morning they're very long. And the second blessing makes sense. It talks about God's love to the people, to the Jewish people. Okay, I get that. The first blessing before the Shema is a very long blessing. And seemingly, we don't understand what is this doing here. Essentially, what we're doing is we're praising God for the luminaries, okay, but very quickly we move to the angels. And we talk about what the Ophanim say, this form of angels, the wheels of the chariot, and what the Chayot HaKodesh say, what the holy animals say, what the Srafim is the angels that burn up like fire. And you may hear the words because we say it in the Kedusha too, Kadosh, 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 Holy, 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 Baruch Kvod Hashem Kamo, blessed is the kingdom of God from its place. In other words, we spend the full blessing every single day in preparation for the Shema, plagiarizing from the angels. And the question is, why are we plagiarizing from the angels? Find a guy, pay him some money, let him write a poem. We'll say a human blessing. Before that, we quote from King David. Okay, that would make sense. The human should sing the human blessings. Why are we plagiarizing from the angels? And why are we spending so much time talking about how the angels love God? What does that help me that the angels love God? I don't love God, or I'm trying to love God. So the mystical interpretation is, who are we talking to? We're not talking to the godly soul. We're not talking to the godly soul. The godly soul is the second blessing. We think about how God loves us, and that therefore how we reciprocate, how God gave us the Torah. The second blessing before the Shema. Oh, so the point is here, there's another problem. Why are these blessings for the Shema? They seemingly on the surface, they have nothing to do with the Shema. Usually a blessing for the mitzvah is, thank you, God, for allowing me to put on tefillin, or commanding me to put on tefillin. So it's related to the mitzvah of putting on tefillin. Here, it doesn't say anything about the Shema. So the answer is that it's a preparation for the Shema, because Shema is about creating a love to God. And this mitzvah, these commandments are, these meditations will allow us to awaken the love to God. So what do we think? So we have two separate blessings. Why do I need two? Why not one? Why is one meditation not good enough? The answer is we're talking to two different parts of self. When we talk about when we talk about the second blessing, the Shema, Ahavat Olam Avtanu, you have loved us with eternal love. We're talking to our godly soul. But what are you going to talk about our animal soul? Our animal soul is not interested in ideas. Our animal soul is interested in intense passion, and it really wants what it feels is good for it, even if that's self-destructive. So now you have to come full circle. So the sages say, you want to talk to your animal soul, you have to go aloy vecha, above the enemy. You have to go to its source. You have to talk to it about what is the source of this love. Yes, you love something materialistic. Why do you love it? Where do you think this love comes from? What do you really want? You know, a person says, I really want this pleasure. Why do I want this pleasure? I'm not sure. Subconsciously, because it's going to make me feel good. What happens if it's not going to make you feel good? What happens if there's something deeper? What you really want is to feel good and to feel loved and to feel accepted. Now, you don't know that, so you think that I really want is chocolate cake. But then I finished the chocolate cake and it didn't give me what I really want. So what you have to do, what the Kabbalah is saying is, when the sages instituted that we're talking about the animals, the holy animals, we're talking about the love of the angels, the audience is really our animal soul. And we're saying, yes, you have love. Yes, you have intense love, and you want things that you think is what you want, but you have to think about, where does this come from? And where does it trickle down from? And if you connect to the source of the love and you fully understand it, and you understand what you really want and why you really want it, then that's also going to trickle down to the person who you are, to the animal soul in its physical manifestation, and it will allow it to expand its horizon and realize that, yes, I want sweet things, but sweet things doesn't have to be an apple. So there's something that could be more sweet than an apple. And that could be music, and that could be ideas, and that could be connection, and that could be spiritual contentment. And basically you're elevating the animal soul because you're connecting it to its source. In other words, don't try to battle the physical manifestation of this negative desire. Find a higher desire that will ultimately affect the animal soul the way it's down here because you're connecting to its source. And the roadmap for that is during prayer, during the preparation for prayer, and we're identifying the source of the love, the source of the animal soul's desire. And that's how you win the battle. You don't win the battle where you try to battle the actual manifestation of this temptation. You have to go to the source. That's the pitch. That's the idea. A lot more to say, but we'll stop here. Go ahead, Vicky, please.
Thank you so much, Rabbi. Idea is so beautiful. I was just wondering how to make it more accessible to the world, because it's I mean, how this desire for good becomes distorted and comes to this world where people desire things that they think it's good for them, but they are not. So that's
I think that it's not hard to make the argument, because many people, everybody, I'm not going to speak for myself, there are desires that are destructive, and I engage in them, and 2 seconds later you know that it didn't bring you happiness, and and the next time it's also not going to bring you happiness, so you know this. So the question is, how do I sense what I'm looking for? How do I give myself what I'm looking for in a way that is going to be lasting? And once I experience that, then maybe it's easier to pull myself away from the destructive instincts, pleasures, to the pleasures that actually give me what I really want. So and you listen to many psychologists and people who study happiness, and they understand that people are not very good at predicting what's going to actually bring them long-term happiness, right? It's not necessarily what you would think. So you have to, not you, but people have to, I'm just saying, the concept that help the person discover what they're really looking for and how pleasurable what they're looking for really is, and how meaningful and how good it feels to do something meaningful and to have a meaningful relationship, and what that does for you, then you're not battling the negative temptation. You're presenting a positive experience, and then it's much easier to shift to that positive experience.
Thank you so much. We're
I'm not the only one saying this. Open up your YouTube, and you'll find other people saying it too. We're just saying it in spiritual terms, but the concept resonates. The concept is a true concept. I'm saying it's an obvious, but I'm saying people who think about happiness, they'll come to some of the same conclusions.
Yeah, but that's a powerful idea about the higher source and
Understand how everything. And so another love. I want. What do I want? I think it's illogical, but there is a logic. What do I want? Because I'm missing something that I think that this is going to give me. Okay, what is that thing that I'm missing? And will this thing be able to give it to me? Yes or no? And is there something else that can give that to me? Is there something higher? Now you went to the source of the desire. And if you go to the source, you can achieve some transformation. But if you head on with the temptation, it's going to be very hard to win. Or you could stop the temptation, but it's going to be very hard to transform. To transform, you have to get to the source. What is it that I really want?
Thank you. We are very fortunate to be able to study with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm fortunate. Wonderful Shabbos. We should go out to the battle and be victorious, both literally and figuratively, on all the fronts. Thank you. Shabbat Shalom.
Shalom.